The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. Chapter 9. Tom let 3 days go by. Then he went down to the beach on the fourth morning around noon and found Dickie alone, in the same spot Tom had seen him first, in front of the gray rocks that extended across the beach from the land. "Morning," Tom called. "Where's Marge?" "Good morning. She's probably working a little late. She'll be down." "Working? She's a writer." "Oh." Dickie puffed on the Italian cigarette in the corner of his mouth. "Where you been keeping yourself? I thought you'd gone." "Sick," Tom said casually, tossing his rolled towel down on the sand, but not too near Dickie's towel. "Oh, the usual upset stomach?" "Hovering between life and the bathroom," Tom said, smiling. "But I'm all right now." He actually had been too weak even to leave the hotel, but he had crawled around on the floor of his room, following the patches of sunlight that came through the window so that he wouldn't look so white the next time he came down to the beach. And he had spent the remainder of his feeble strength studying an Italian conversation book that he had bought in the hotel lobby. Tom went down to the water, went confidently up to his waist, and stopped there, splashing the water over his shoulders. He lowered himself until the water reached his chin, floated around a little, then came slowly in. "Can I invite you for a drink at the hotel before you go up to your house?" Tom asked Dickie. "And Marge, too, if she comes. I wanted to give you your bathrobe and socks, you know." "Oh, yes, thanks very much. I'd like to have a drink." He went back to his Italian newspaper. Tom stretched out on his towel. He heard the village clock strike 1. "Doesn't look as if Marge is coming down," Dickie said. "I think I'll be going along." Tom got up. They walked up to the Miramare, saying practically nothing to each other, except that Tom invited Dickie to lunch with him, and Dickie declined because the maid had his lunch ready at the house, he said. They went up to Tom's room, and Dickie tried the bathrobe on and held the socks up to his bare feet. Both the bathrobe and the socks were the right size, and as Tom had anticipated, Dickie was extremely pleased with the bathrobe. "And this," Tom said, taking a square package wrapped in drugstore paper from a bureau drawer. "Your mother sent you some nose drops, too." Dickie smiled. "I don't need them anymore, that was sinus, but I'll take them off your hands." Now Dickie had everything, Tom thought, everything he had to offer. He was going to refuse the invitation for a drink, too, Tom knew. Tom followed him toward the door. "You know, your father's very concerned about you coming home. He asked me to give you a good talking to, which of course I won't, but I'll still have to tell him something. I promised to write him." Dickie turned with his hand on the doorknob. "I don't know what my father thinks I'm doing over here, drinking myself to death or what. I'll probably fly home this winter for a few days, but I don't intend to stay over there. I'm happier here. If I went back there to live, my father will be after me to work in Burke Greenleaf. I couldn't possibly paint. I happen to like painting, and I think it's my business how I spend my life." "I understand, but he said he wouldn't try to make you work in his firm if you come back unless you wanted to work in the designing department, and he said you liked that." "Well, my father and I have been over that. Thanks anyway, Tom, for delivering the message on the clothes. It was very nice of you." Dickie held out his hand. Tom couldn't have made himself take the hand. This was the very edge of failure as far as Mr. Greenleaf was concerned, and failure with Dickie. "I think I ought to tell you something else," Tom said with a smile. "Your father sent me over here especially to ask you to come home." "What do you mean?" Dickie frowned. "Paid your way?" Yes. It was his one last chance to amuse Dickie or to repel him, to make Dickie burst out laughing or go out and slam the door in disgust. But the smile was coming, the long corners of his mouth going up, the way Tom remembered Dickie's smile. "Paid your way. What do you know? He's getting desperate, isn't he?" Dickie closed the door again. "He approached me in a bar in New York," Tom said. "I told him I wasn't a close friend of yours, but he insisted I could help if I came over. I told him I'd try." "How did he ever meet you?" "Through the Shreevers. I hardly know the Shreevers, but there it was. I was your friend and I could do you a lot of good." They laughed. "I don't want you to think I'm someone who tried to take advantage of your father," Tom said. "I expect to find a job somewhere in Europe soon, and I'll be able to pay him back my passage money eventually. He bought me a round-trip ticket." "Oh, don't bother. It goes in the Burke Greenleaf expense list. I can just see Dad approaching you in a bar." "Which bar was it?" "Raoul's. Matter of fact, he followed me from the Green Cage." Tom watched Dickie's face for a sign of recognition of the Green Cage, a very popular bar, but there was no recognition. They had a drink downstairs in the hotel bar. They drank to Herbert Richard Greenleaf. "I just realized today's Sunday," Dickie said. "Marge went to church. You better come up and have lunch with us. We always have chicken on Sunday. You know, it's an old American custom, chicken on Sunday." Dickie wanted to go by Marge's house to see if she was still there. They climbed some steps from the main road up the side of a stone wall, crossed part of somebody's garden, and climbed more steps. Marge's house was a rather sloppy-looking one-story affair with a messy garden at one end, a couple of buckets and a garden hose cluttering the path to the door, and the feminine touch represented by her tomato-colored bathing suit and a bra hanging over a windowsill. Through an open window, Tom had a glimpse of a disorderly table with a typewriter on it. "Hi," she said, opening the door. "Hello, Tom. Where you been all this time?" She offered them a drink, but discovered there was only half an inch of gin in her bottle of Gilbey's. "It doesn't matter, we're going to my house," Dickie said. He strolled around Marge's bedroom living room with an air of familiarity, as if he lived half the time here himself. He bent over a flower pot in which a tiny plant of some sort was growing and touched its leaf delicately with his forefinger. "Tom has something funny to tell you," he said. "Tell her, Tom." Tom took a breath and began. He made it very funny, and Marge laughed like someone who hadn't heard anything funny to laugh at in years. "When I saw him coming in Raoul's after me, I was ready to climb out of a back window." His tongue rattled on almost independently of his brain. His brain was estimating how high his stock was shooting up with Dickie and Marge. He could see it in their faces. The climb up the hill to Dickie's house didn't seem half so long as before. Delicious smells of roasting chicken drifted out on the terrace. Dickie made some martinis. Tom showered and then Dickie showered and came out and poured himself a drink just like the first time, but the atmosphere now was totally changed. Dickie sat down in a wicker chair and swung his legs over one of the arms. "Tell me more," he said, smiling. "What kind of work do? You said you might take a job." "Why, do you have a job for me?" "Can't say that I have." "Oh, I can do a number of things. Valeting, babysitting, accounting. I got an unfortunate talent for figures. No matter how drunk I get, I can always tell when a waiter's cheating me on a bill. I can forge a signature, fly a helicopter, handle dice, impersonate practically anybody, cook, and do a one-man show in a nightclub in case the regular entertainer's sick. Shall I go on?" Tom was leaning forward, counting them off on his fingers. He could have gone on. "What kind of one-man show?" Dickie asked. "Well," Tom sprang up. "This, for example." He struck a pose with one hand on his hip, one foot extended. "This is Lady Ashburton, sampling the American subway. She's never been in the underground in London, but she wants to take back some American experiences." Tom did it all in pantomime, searching for a coin, finding it didn't go into the slot, buying a token, puzzling over which stairs to go down, registering alarm at the noise and the long express ride, puzzling again as to how to get out of the place. Here Marge came out, and Dickie told her it was an Englishwoman in the subway, but Marge didn't seem to get it and asked, "What?" Walking through a door which could only be the door of the men's room from her twitching horror of this and that, which augmented until she fainted. Tom fainted gracefully on the terrace glider. "Wonderful!" Dickie yelled, clapping. Marge wasn't laughing. She stood there looking a little blank. Neither of them bothered to explain it to her. She didn't look as if she had that kind of sense of humor anyway, Tom thought. Tom took a gulp of his martini, terribly pleased with himself. "I'll do another for you sometime," he said to Marge, but mostly to indicate to Dickie that he had another one to do. "Dinner ready?" Dickie asked her. "I'm starving." "I've been waiting for the damn artichokes to get done. You know from that front hall it'll barely make anything up to a boil." She smiled at Tom. "Dickie's very old-fashioned about some things, Tom, the things he doesn't have to fool with. There's still only a wood stove here, and he refuses to buy a refrigerator or even an icebox." "One of the reasons I fled America," Dickie said. "Those things are a waste of money in a country with so many servants. What would Ermelinda do with herself if she could cook a meal in half an hour?" He stood up. "Come on in, Tom. I'll show you some of my paintings." Dickie led the way into the big room Tom had looked into a couple of times on his way to and from the shower, the room with a long couch under the two windows and the big easel in the middle of the floor. "This is one of Marge I'm working on now." He gestured to the picture on the easel. "Oh," Tom said with interest. It wasn't good in his opinion, probably in anybody's opinion. The wild enthusiasm of her smile was a bit off. Her skin was as red as an Indian's. If Marge hadn't been the only girl around with blonde hair, he wouldn't have noticed any resemblance at all. "And these, a lot of landscapes," Dickie said with a deprecatory laugh, though obviously he wanted Tom to say something complimentary about them because obviously he was proud of them. They were all wild and hasty and monotonously similar. The combination of terracotta and electric blue was in nearly every one. Terracotta roofs and mountains and bright electric blue seas. It was the blue he had put in Marge's eyes, too. "My surrealist effort," Dickie said, bracing another canvas against his knee. Tom winced with almost a personal shame. It was Marge again, undoubtedly, though with long snake-like hair and, worst of all, two horizons in her eyes, with a miniature landscape of Montebello's houses and mountains in one eye and the beach in the other full of little red people. "Yes, I like that," Tom said. Mr. Greenleaf had been right. Yet it gave Dickie something to do, kept him out of trouble, Tom supposed, just as it gave thousands of lousy amateur painters all over America something to do. He was only sorry that Dickie fell into this category as a painter because he wanted Dickie to be much more. "I will never set the world on fire as a painter," Dickie said, "but I get a great deal of pleasure out of it." Yes, Tom wanted to forget all about the paintings and forget that Dickie painted. "Can I see the rest of the house?" "Absolutely. You haven't seen the saloon, have you?" Dickie opened a door in the hall that led into a very large room with a fireplace, sofas, bookshelves, and 3 exposures, to the terrace, to the land on the other side of the house, and to the front garden. Dickie said that in summer he did not use the room because he liked to save it as a change of scene for the winter. It was more of a bookish den than a living room, Tom thought. It surprised him. He had Dickie figured out as a young man who was not particularly brainy and who probably spent most of his time playing. Perhaps he was wrong. But he didn't think he was wrong in feeling that Dickie was bored at the moment and needed someone to show him how to have fun. "What's upstairs?" Tom asked. The upstairs was disappointing. Dickie's bedroom in the corner of the house above the terrace was stark and empty. A bed, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair looking lost and unrelated in all the space. A narrow bed, too, hardly wider than a single bed. The other 3 rooms on the second floor were not even furnished, or at least not completely. One of them held only firewood and a pile of canvas scraps. There was certainly no sign of Marge anywhere, least of all in Dickie's bedroom. "How about going to Naples with me sometime?" Tom asked. "I didn't have much of a chance to see it on my way down." "All right," Dickie said. "Marge and I are going Saturday afternoon. We have dinner there nearly every Saturday night and treat ourselves to a taxi or a carrozza ride back. Come along." "I meant in the daytime or some weekday so I could see a little more," Tom said, hoping to avoid Marge in the excursion. "Or do you paint all day?" "No. There's a 12 o'clock bus Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I suppose we could go tomorrow if you feel like it." "Fine," Tom said, though he still wasn't sure that Marge wouldn't be asked along. "Marge is a Catholic?" he asked as they went down the stairs. "With a vengeance. She was converted about 6 months ago by an Italian she had a mad crush on. Could that man talk? He was here for a few months, resting up after a ski accident. Marge consoles herself for the loss of Eduardo by embracing his religion." "I had the idea she was in love with you." "With me? Don't be silly." The meal was ready when they went out on the terrace. There were even hot biscuits with butter made by Marge. "Do you know Vic Simmons in New York?" Tom asked Dickie. Vic had quite a salon of artists, writers, and dancers in New York, but Dickie didn't know of him. Tom asked him about 2 or 3 other people, also without success. Tom hoped Marge would leave after the coffee, but she didn't. When she left the terrace for a moment, Tom said, "Can I invite you for dinner at my hotel tonight?" "Thank you. What time?" 7:30, so we'll have a little time for cocktails? After all, it's your father's money," Tom added with a smile. Dickie laughed. "All right, cocktails and a good bottle of wine. Marge." Marge was just coming back. "We're dining tonight at the Miramar. Compliments of Greenleaf Para." So Marge was coming too, and there was nothing Tom could do about it. After all, it was Dickie's father's money. The dinner that evening was pleasant, but Marge's presence kept Tom from talking about anything he would have liked to talk about, and he did not feel even like being witty in Marge's presence. Marge knew some of the people in the dining room, and after dinner she excused herself and took her coffee over to another table and sat down. "How long are you going to be here?" Dickie asked. "Oh, at least a week, I'd say," Tom replied. "Because," Dickie's face had flushed a little over the cheekbones. The Chianti had put him into a good mood. "If you're going to be here a little longer, why don't you stay with me? There's no use staying in a hotel unless you really prefer it." "Thank you very much," Tom said. "There's a bed in the maid's room which you didn't see. Ermelinda doesn't sleep in. I'm sure we can make out with the furniture that's scattered around if you think you'd like to." "I'm sure I'd like to. By the way, your father gave me $600 for expenses and I've still got about $500 of it. I think we both ought to have a little fun on it, don't you?" $500, Dickie said, as if he'd never seen that much money in one lump in his life. "We could pick up a little car for that." Tom didn't contribute to the car idea. That wasn't his idea of having fun. He wanted to fly to Paris. Marge was coming back, he saw. The next morning, he moved in. Dickie and Ermelinda had installed an armoire and a couple of chairs in one of the upstairs rooms, and Dickie had thumbtacked a few reproductions of mosaic portraits from St. Mark's Cathedral on the walls. Tom helped Dickie carry up the narrow iron bed from the maid's room. They were finished before 12, a little light-headed from the frascati they had been sipping as they worked. "Are we still going to Naples?" Tom asked. "Certainly." Dickie looked at his watch. "It's only 11:45. We can make the 12 o'clock bus." They took nothing with them but their jackets and Tom's book of traveler's checks. The bus was just arriving as they reached the post office. Tom and Dickie stood by the door waiting for people to get off. Dickie pulled himself up right into the face of a young man with red hair and a loud sports shirt. An American. "Dickie!" "Freddie!" Dickie yelled. "What are you doing here?" "Came to see you and the Ketchies. They're putting me up for a few days." "Shalagante. I'm off to Naples with a friend. Tom?" Dickie beckoned Tom over and introduced them. The American's name was Freddie Miles. Tom thought he was hideous. Tom hated red hair, especially this kind of carrot red hair with white skin and freckles. Freddie had large red-brown eyes that seemed to wobble in his head as if he were cockeyed, or perhaps he was only one of those people who never looked at anyone they were talking to. He was also overweight. Tom turned away from him, waiting for Dickie to finish his conversation. They were holding up the bus, Tom noticed. Dickie and Freddie were talking about skiing, making a date for sometime in December in a town Tom had never heard of. "There'll be about 15 of us at Cortina by the 2nd, Freddie said. "A real bang-up party like last year. 3 weeks if our money holds out." "If we hold out," Dickie said. "See you tonight, Fred." Tom boarded the bus after Dickie. There were no seats and they were wedged between a skinny sweating man who smelled and a couple of old peasant women who smelled worse. Just as they were leaving the village, Dickie remembered that Marge was coming for lunch as usual because they had thought yesterday that Tom's moving would cancel the Naples trip. Dickie shouted for the driver to stop. The bus stopped with a squeal of brakes and a lurch that threw everybody who was standing off balance, and Dickie put his head through a window and called, "Gino! Gino!" A little boy on the road came running up to take the 100-lira bill that Dickie was holding out to him. Dickie said something in Italian, and the boy said, "Subito, signor," and flew up the road. Dickie thanked the driver, and the bus started again. "I told him to tell Marge we'd be back tonight, but probably late," Dickie said. "Good." The bus spilled them into a big cluttered square in Naples, and they were suddenly surrounded by pushcarts of grapes, figs, pastry, and watermelon, and screamed at by adolescent boys with fountain pens and mechanical toys. The people made way for Dickie. "I know a good place for lunch," Dickie said. "A real Neapolitan pizzeria. Do you like pizza?" "Yes." The pizzeria was up a street too narrow and steep for cars. Strings of beads hanging in the doorway, a decanter of wine on every table, and there were only 6 tables in the whole place, the kind of place you could sit in for hours and drink wine and not be disturbed. They sat there until 5 o'clock, when Dickie said it was time to move on to the Galleria. Dickie apologized for not taking him to the art museum, which had original Da Vinci's and El Greco's, he said, but they could see that at another time. Dickie had spent most of the afternoon talking about Freddie Miles, and Tom had found it as uninteresting as Freddie's face. Freddie was the son of an American hotel chain owner and a playwright, self-styled, Tom gathered, because he had written only 2 plays and neither had seen Broadway. Freddie had a house in Cognes-sur-Mer, and Dickie had stayed with him several weeks before he came to Italy. "This is what I like," Dickie said expansively in the Galleria. "Sitting at a table and watching the people go by. It does something to your outlook on life. The Anglo-Saxons made a great mistake by not staring at people from a sidewalk table." Tom nodded. He had heard it before. He was waiting for something profound and original from Dickie. Dickie was handsome. He looked unusual with his long, finely cut face, his quick, intelligent eyes, the proud way he carried himself regardless of what he was wearing. He was wearing broken-down sandals and rather soiled white pants now, but he sat there as if he owned the Galleria, chatting in Italian with the waiter when he brought their espressos. "Ciao," he called to an Italian boy who was passing by. "Ciao, Dickie." "He changes Marge's traveler's checks on Saturdays," Dickie explained to Tom. A well-dressed Italian greeted Dickie with a warm handshake and sat down at the table with them. Tom listened to their conversation in Italian, making out a word here and there. He was beginning to feel tired. "Want to go to Rome?" Dickie asked him suddenly. "Sure," Tom said. "Now?" He stood up, reaching for money to pay the little tabs that the waiter had stuck under their coffee cups. The Italian had a long gray Cadillac equipped with Venetian blinds, a 4-tone horn, and a blaring radio that he and Dickie seemed content to shout over. They reached the outskirts of Rome in about 2 hours. Tom sat up as they drove along the Appian Way, especially for his benefit, the Italian told Tom, because Tom had not seen it before. The road was bumpy in spots. There were stretches of original Roman brick left bare to show people how Roman roads felt, the Italian said. The flat fields to left and right looked desolate in the twilight, like an ancient graveyard, Tom thought, with just a few tombs and remains of tombs still standing. The Italian dropped them in the middle of a street in Rome and said an abrupt goodbye. "He's in a hurry," Dickie said. "Gotta see his girlfriend and get away before the husband comes home at 11. There's the music hall I was looking for. Come on." They bought tickets for the music hall show that evening. There was still an hour before the performance, and they went to the Via Veneto, took a sidewalk table at one of the cafes, and ordered Americanos. Dickie didn't know anybody in Rome, Tom noticed, or at least none who passed by, and they watched hundreds of Italians and Americans pass by their table. Tom got very little out of the music hall show, but he tried his very best. Dickie proposed leaving before the show was over. Then they caught a carrozza and drove around the city, past fountain after fountain, through the Forum and around the Colosseum. The moon had come out. Tom was still a little sleepy, but the sleepiness, underlaid with excitement at being in Rome for the first time, put him into a receptive, mellow mood. They sat slumped in the carrozza, each with a sandaled foot propped on a knee, and it seemed to Tom that he was looking in a mirror when he looked at Dickie's leg and his propped foot beside him. They were the same height and very much the same weight, Dickie perhaps a bit heavier, and they wore the same size bathrobe, socks, and probably shirts. Dickie even said, "Thank you, Mr. Greenleaf," when Tom paid the carrozza driver. Tom felt a little weird. They were in even finer mood by 1 in the morning after a bottle and a half of wine between them at dinner. They walked with their arms around each other's shoulders, singing, and around a dark corner they somehow bumped into a girl and knocked her down. They lifted her up apologizing and offered to escort her home. She protested, they insisted, one on either side of her. She had to catch a certain trolley, she said. Dickie wouldn't hear of it. Dickie got a taxi. Dickie and Tom sat very properly on the jump seats with their arms folded like a couple of footmen, and Dickie talked to her and made her laugh. Tom could understand nearly everything Dickie said. They helped the girl out in a little street that looked like Naples again, and she said, "Grazie tante," and shook hands with both of them, then vanished into an absolutely black doorway. "Did you hear that?" Dickie said. "She said we were the nicest Americans she'd ever met." "You know what most crummy Americans would do in a case like that? Rape her," Tom said. "Now where are we?" Dickie asked, turning completely around. Neither had the slightest idea where they were. They walked for several blocks without finding a landmark or a familiar street name. They urinated against a dark wall, then drifted on. "When the dawn comes up, we can see where we are," Dickie said cheerfully. He looked at his watch. "It's only a couple more hours." "Fine. It's worth it to see a nice girl home, isn't it?" Dickie asked, staggering a little. "Sure it is. I like girls," Tom said protestingly. "But it's just as well Marge isn't here tonight. We never could have seen that girl home with Marge with us." "Oh, I don't know," Dickie said thoughtfully, looking down at his weaving feet. "Marge isn't—" "I only mean if Marge was here, we'd be worrying about a hotel for the night. We'd be in the damn hotel, probably. We wouldn't be seeing half of Rome." "That's right." Dickie swung an arm around his shoulder. Dickie shook his shoulder roughly. Tom tried to roll out from under it and grab his hand. "Dickie!" Tom opened his eyes and looked into the face of a policeman. Tom sat up. He was in a park. It was dawn. Dickie was sitting on the grass beside him, talking very calmly to the policeman in Italian. Tom felt for the rectangular lump of his traveler's checks. They were still in his pocket. "Passaporte," the policeman hurled at them again, and again Dickie launched into his calm explanation. Tom knew exactly what Dickie was saying. He was saying that they were Americans and they didn't have their passports because they had only gone out for a little walk to look at the stars. Tom had an impulse to laugh. He stood up and staggered, dusting his clothing. Dickie was up too, and they began to walk away, though the policeman was still yelling at them. Dickie said something back to him in a courteous explanatory tone. At least the policeman was not following them. "We do look pretty cruddy," Dickie said. Tom nodded. There was a long rip in his trouser knee where he had probably fallen. Their clothes were crumpled and grass-stained and filthy with dust and sweat, but now they were shivering with cold. They went into the first cafe they came to and had cafe latte and sweet rolls, then several Italian brandies that tasted awful but warmed them. Then they began to laugh. They were still drunk. By 11 o'clock, they were in Naples just in time to catch the bus for Montebello. It was wonderful to think of going back to Rome when they were more presentably dressed and seeing all the museums they had missed, and it was wonderful to think of lying on the beach at Montebello this afternoon, baking in the sun. But they never got to the beach. They had showers at Dickie's house, then fell down in their respective beds and slept until Marge woke them up around 4. Marge was annoyed because Dickie hadn't sent her a telegram saying he was spending the night in Rome. "Not that I minded you spending the night, but I thought you were in Naples and anything could happen in Naples." "Oh," Dickie drawled with a glance at Tom. He was making Bloody Marys for all of them. Tom kept his mouth mysteriously shut. He wasn't going to tell Marge anything they had done. Let her imagine what she pleased. Dickie had made it evident that they had had a very good time. Tom noticed that she looked Dickie over with disapproval of his hangover, his unshaven face, and the drink he was taking now. There was something in Marge's eyes when she was very serious that made her look wise and old in spite of the naive clothes she wore and her windblown hair and her general air of a Girl Scout. She had the look of a mother or an older sister now, the old feminine disapproval of the destructive play of little boys and men. La-di-da. Or was it jealousy? She seemed to know that Dickie had formed a closer bond with him in 24 hours just because he was another man than she could ever have with Dickie, whether he loved her or not, and he didn't. After a few moments she loosened up, however, and the look went out of her eyes. Dickie left him with Marge on the terrace. Tom asked her about the book she was writing. It was a book about Montebello, she said, with her own photographs. She told him she was from Ohio and showed him a picture which she carried in her wallet of her family's house. It was just a plain clapboard house, but it was home, Marge said with a smile. She pronounced the adjective clabbered, which amused Tom, because that was the word she used to describe people who were drunk. Just a few minutes before, she had said to Dickie, "You look absolutely clabbered." Her speech, Tom thought, was abominable, both her choice of words and her pronunciation. He tried to be especially pleasant to her. He felt he could afford to be. He walked with her to the gate, and they said a friendly goodbye to each other, but neither said anything about their all getting together later that day or tomorrow. There was no doubt about it, Marge was a little angry with Dickie.